This is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the NZXT H6 Flow RGB. I'm here to talk to you about my experiences with this case and my thoughts and feelings about it after using it for a while, but also building it in two different variations, both with and without vertical GPU mounting. And I've done a full in-depth build guide on this case that I'll link to in the description, where I've gone into a lot of depth on how to set it up and what to do when doing so. So I want to talk to you about my experiences with it, the things of interest about it, the complexities, and perhaps some of the things to bear in mind if you're thinking about purchasing. I will start by saying that this is one of the better NZXT cases that I've seen, and an obvious highlight is the three 120mm F120 RGB fans included as standard and pre-installed on that interesting angled side panel, which essentially means that they're blowing cold air onto your graphics card. And that's an interesting setup because it also means that you can have the best of both worlds with a glass front panel and still have good airflow inside, in theory. And you'll see that I've got a 240mm radiator mounted in there, which might be a bit of an odd combination with a Core i9-14900K, but that's a separate video, so stick with me for that. But here I want to talk to you about some of the things of interest about the H6 Flow RGB, so let's dive in. This is a fairly interesting compact case, which manages to cram quite a lot into a small space. It will fit up to an ATX motherboard, which, as you'll see, looks pretty nice by the end of it. It did feel quite small to build in after building in the Lee & Lee Dynamic Evo XL just recently, so quite a challenge, but there are some really nice things about it. You'll see it's got some really nice tall feet that sit quite high off the desk, so you should get good airflow from the underside where you can mount some fans, and I'll show you that in a second. And then obviously it looks the business from multiple angles as well. You have the ability to mount up to a 360mm radiator on the top, as well as a 120mm fan on the back, and two 140mm fans on the bottom. As I said, it comes pre-installed and pre-wired with three 120mm fans on the side here, and they're set to intake in this current setup, which means obviously the RGB would mostly be seen on the outside of the case, but it is still seen from the inside as well. At the rear, you have a reasonable amount of room. This is a dual chamber case, so you've got space for wiring and obviously for a pretty large power supply unit, as you'll see in a minute, and also space to put in up to two SSDs and one hard disk drive. Now, even if you are terrible at cable management, as I am, and you have loads of things crammed in there, you can see I've got multiple RGB controllers and a USB hub, for example, you can still close the door and hide that shame away, and that is a big tick in my book. And you'll obviously see good airflow panels as well with plenty of venting on them. The channels for the wiring, though, are a bit questionable, because the Velcro ties that you can see here aren't really long enough and there's not quite enough space there, but you will notice there are multiple cable tidying hooks around the back, so it is possible to tidy things up nicely still. Now, I really think the quality of this case is fantastic. It's got a good heft to it and it feels nice and solid compared to a lot of older, cheaper NZXT cases I've seen, which is definitely a bonus. The cabling down the left-hand side is one of the first things I want to talk about, because this was something to bear in mind, I think, if you're building in this case, is as standard, it's all connected up and wired already for you, so you just need to connect it up to your motherboard. Now, this sounds great in theory, but once you get further into the build, if you're doing like I am, putting in extra fans and an NZXT all-in-one cooler, it does become a bit weird. So first of all, you've got three fans with the power connection connected up via a splitter, which goes into a single connector. And then the same logic is applied to an RGB connection. So you've got three fans RGB connectors going into one cable, which is then for the 5V RGB connector on your motherboard. So to quickly demonstrate that outside the case so you can see it nice and easily, here's a Strix motherboard Z790 that I'm working on. And the power cable will connect up to the chassis fan connections on the bottom, for example, or sys fan headers on a motherboard. So whatever motherboard you're using, the logic is there. So the fans are then powered by your motherboard, and that's how they will spin up. And then you have the RGB connection for them, which connects up to the 5V RGB header on your motherboard, assuming you've got one. Now, most modern motherboards do. Usually there's one at the bottom and one at the top. And so fairly logical, straightforward connection. If that's all you're doing, which obviously you aren't going to be, you're going to be installing other fans. as I am here with the F140 RGB core fans. Now, I've done a wiring guide separately on these fans that I'll link to in the description. It's worth watching because it goes into some depth on the logic of it. But I am going to show you how it works and the setup for it, and why that first wiring that I just showed you for the fans is kind of illogical, because if we use the controller that you've just seen there, with these 140mm fans, that obviously controls the RGB lighting, but that's done via NZXT's CAM software, which is controlled via a USB connection on your motherboard. And if you control the lighting for these two fans that I'm putting in now via CAM, but then those three fans that are connected to your case via your motherboard software and the 5-volt connection, then you're going to have lighting that's out of sync, so it's kind of weird. However, as you'll see, you do get a nice recessed area for the fans, which is beneficial in two ways. One is the fan trays themselves are kind of hidden away down there, so it neatens things up, and you can run the cables through the rear underneath that to make it look neater. There are some things that are a bit odd here though. For example, you'll notice I said 140mm fans. That's because you'll see that the rubber washers in here are 440mm fans. I don't think you can fit 120mm in there as an option. Also, you'll notice that although there's some nice holes at the bottom there doesn't seem to be a way to remove it. So it's not got your usual sort of dust filter that you can take off and clean. So over time, this is probably going to get dirty. And to clean it is going to be a bit of an undertaking, because you're going to have to blow compressed air through it or remove those fans to clean it up. It's going to be a bit of a problem in the future, probably. The other thing about fans that you'll notice is if you want to install another fan at the rear for exhaust purposes, then the option is basically one 120mm fan. You can't put 140 back there. I know that will annoy some people because the logic here is a bit weird. We've got some 120mm, we've got some 140mm. You can't put 140 at the back. Bit of an odd design choice. Obviously, this is coming from the guy that used a 240mm radiator in a case that could take a 360 though, so feel free to point out my errors there. Being a fairly compact case, the H6 Flow RGB has limited options in terms of SSDs and hard disk drive mounting. You can only put two 2.5-inch SSDs and one 3.5-inch hard disk drive in this cage that then installs into the case, and that's it. But that's not really an issue, and the mounting for it is actually really nicely thought out. There's a nice bay here that clips into place and screws in with thumb screws, and there's plenty of access to be able to plug the cables in on the underside. You'll see it secures in various different ways as well, so there shouldn't be any problems with that knocking about in there or vibrations from the drive. In terms of mounting the motherboard, this is an ATX board, and you'll see it's quite roomy in some ways and not in others. Notice how far the bottom of the board sits from the bottom of the case, for example. That becomes a little bit fiddly in a minute with doing the front panel connections and such, but it does look nicely flush in other ways, and there's still plenty of space at the top. There's also plenty of room at the rear for your power supply unit. This is a Corsair RM Shift 1000X, which is a 1000-watt power supply unit, and you'll see that nestles in there quite nicely. The shift is a little bit tricky in this build because the GPU cables become a problem, but routing the rest of the cables was fairly easy. Although, as I noted earlier, getting those Velcro ties to cover some of the cables was a bit tricky, and I had to do a lot of cable tidying down the side in order to manage things properly. However, one nice thing is the power cabling for the motherboard is actually fairly easy to negotiate in there. Obviously, the 24-pin is easy to plug in, but above the motherboard, you also have the two 8-pin CPU power connectors, and they were really easy to do as long as you haven't got an AIO mounted there. But you can see there's plenty of space in there to negotiate those cables around, plug things in and tidy them up, which is definitely a highlight. However, as I noted already, once you get near the end of the build and you've thrown a lot more things into the case, things become a little bit trickier in terms of connecting up all the different devices. You can see me here using an NZXT USB hub, which became essential with all the RGB connectors I ended up having in here. And then you've got to connect that to the motherboard, as well as the front panel connections, the HD audio and other things. And the space between the bottom of the case and the motherboard itself became a bit of a problem, especially because the connectors are just so low and close there, so it was really fiddly to get some of those in, and it's quite tight. The benefit of this is it means the cables are really neat down the bottom because you can barely see any of them, but it was a little bit fiddly during the build process. The end result, though, looks really good. Obviously, this would be much better with a 360mm radiator on top, and cooling-wise, that would probably be better, although I'm going to do a separate video on that in the future. Also, despite being a compact case, it's actually large enough to fit a pretty chunky graphics card. So this is a Strix 4090, so a pretty big beast. And as you've seen, I've mounted it in both the classic standard orientation and used NZXT's vertical GPU mount to put it in vertically as well. There's enough room here that it sits nice and far back from the glass, but not super close to the motherboard. And also both the glass on the end and the side are not in the way. So you can see there's still plenty of space from multiple angles, which means cooling is not going to be an issue. I did notice that when putting it in this position, the tubes from the all-in-one cooler kind of press against the glass, but beyond that, there's minimal problems. So that's definitely a benefit. So it surprised me sort of in how small it is and yet in how much it can take up in terms of what you can put in there and the flexibility of it. All told, it's a really good case. I haven't found any issues with it really. It has got a little bit hot. There is some thermal throttling from the CPU, but I believe that's probably down to the cooler, the size of it, and maybe some things that I need to tweak. I'm going to revisit that very shortly in a separate video, so subscribe if you haven't already to see that and find out more about the cooling performance of the system. But I will say that the GPU has been running at very good temperatures under load in various different games. It's been keeping nice and cool, isn't running too hot, just the CPU I'm having issues with. But generally speaking, it's been glorious. It doesn't run very loud, even with all these fans in there, and it looks the part as well. I'm really happy with how the builds come out. Let me know what you think in the comments, and check out the full build guide if you'd like to find out more and see all the little details in all the glory. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.